So far we've discussed how to build an AF table by hand and also how to import data from Excel. Now, of course, the import function can be used with any of our OLADB data sources. Before we wrap up this topic of AF tables and the table lookup data reference, I'd like to talk a little bit about linking to tables and also getting data from SQL data sources, since that's a very common use case for AF tables. As you saw before, we have two options here. We can import data or we can link data. And I'll talk a little bit about the difference between those two. So if we hover over these buttons, we get a nice little description built into AF. You can see for an external table, AF is going to go out, connect to the external data source, and pull in that data to its own table, which is stored internally in the AF database. And therefore, the table data is read-write. That means we could delete rows, we could change values. We can basically manipulate that table however we want. On the other hand, if we were to link to a table, we can see that the AF server, whenever data is needed from a table, will go and connect to the external source, typically a SQL source, and we'll pull back that data as a read-only source. So we won't be able to edit any of that data. So in addition to this difference between imported tables being read-write and linked tables being read-only, you might be wondering what some other reasons would be to choose one over the other. One could be performance on the AF server side. As a rule of thumb, we suggest that if you have a table larger than 10,000 rows, you use a link to an external table rather than an imported or internal table. Another could be security or performance concerns on the SQL server side. It might be that your database administrators don't mind you connecting to their server for a one-time data import, but they wouldn't want the AF server to have an open connection and be making frequent data calls to their server by way of a linked table. Last would be that if your external data source is something that gets updated on a regular basis, maybe you have a maintenance database that you're linking to get equipment information, and you know that your maintenance group updates that table once a day or once a week, and you want to make sure that you have the freshest information for use by AF, you can use a linked table, and you can use this cache interval setting to make sure that you get periodic updates to your linked table. So here I could set this for a cache interval of 1 day, and then if I was using a linked table, once a day the AF server would go and check for updates and update its local cache. Now, if you want more information on AF caching, you could suggest this KB article 00539 for further reading. So let's undo this cache interval change that I made to my imported Excel table. So we don't want to do that. And now let's look at how we would build a link table to a SQL server. So to get started, let's go ahead and build a new table. And we'll call this one HVAC equipment. And in the description, we'll say link table to equipment info in SQL. Now the sample database we'll be using for this SQL link will be a database we'll look at later when we start to build elements and attributes for the actual equipment in our HVAC system. To take a look at it, I'm going to open up SQL Server Management Studio. So if you've used SQL before, then you may have gotten into SQL Server Management Studio. It's just a Microsoft tool that lets you look at a SQL server and the various databases and tables contained there. So this is my local SQL Server instance. I'm going to connect to that, and now I can view the databases there. So you have a few sample databases here, the PyFD, which is the backend database for the AF server, and here's my HVAC equipment database, which has the information I'm looking for. So if I expand the tables, here we have this nameplate table, and I'll select the top 1,000 rows, And SQL Server Management Studio will build this nice query for me, and it'll return the data in my table here. So you can see we have several columns here, the name of each piece of equipment, the blowers, chillers, and heaters, the type of equipment, the equipment code, install date, the manufacturer of the equipment, and the serial number of the equipment. So this is a table that we're going to be using later to get some metadata for our chillers and blowers and heaters. And so I'm going to want to bring that into an AF table. Now, as before with the data import, there were several pieces of information we needed. Before, we needed to know that we were using an Excel file, we needed the file path for that file, and we needed the sheet name, so we knew where to find the data within the file. Here we're using this very similar hierarchical structure. We're going to want to know the SQL Server instance, which is here, Vinkman/SQL Express. We want to know which database to look in. In this case, it's HVAC equipment. And finally, we want to know which table contains the data we want within that database. And in this case, it's going to be nameplate. So let's jump back over to PySystem Explorer and build our linked table. So I'll start by clicking the link button. And again, you'll see we need to build our connection string. And we'll get this nice little GUI to help us out. And we can use this Microsoft LED provider for SQL Server, or I also know that this SQL Server native client will work. And then it's going to ask me to enter the server name. Now this is that SQL Server instance that we had before. I could click this drop down and it would basically show me all the different servers on the network. Or to avoid that, I can just type it in by hand. Vinkman/SQL Express, as we saw before. I'm going to use Windows Integrated Security, and then it's going to ask me to select a database. Since I've specified my server instance, it's going to go and show me a list of databases there, and I wanted the HVAC equipment database. And now we're to the point where we can test this connection. Looks good. Go ahead and hit OK. Now the next step is to build our data query, similar to what we did before. So again, we'll start with a select statement. I'm just going to do select star to get everything, and a from statement. Now this is where we need the table name. In this case it was nameplate. No spaces. And that should be it. And there's some security settings here that I won't really talk about right now. But suffice to say, this is set up so that it will work on my system. I'll click OK. Now if we go in and check our table, we can see our locally cached version of this information. Now again, you'll note this is all read-only. I can't click in any of these cells to change anything. The table definition, I can't change any of the data types because that's predefined by the columns on the external server. One thing I can do is add units of measure if I want, because those are only defined with NAF. Here, none of these columns actually have any units, so we won't worry about changing those. And now we have a linked table that we can use with our table lookup data reference. I mentioned before what we could do if we're having data updates on the external data source. Let me check this table in. And this has manual refresh, so if I need to refresh the data in this table, I can simply right-click on the table here in the library and click refresh. For an imported table, I can right-click and do a re-import of the table, so that'll go connect to the data source again and pull all that data back. And finally, I mentioned that for these linked tables, we could also set a cache interval, which would define how frequently the AF server can connect to the external data source and refresh its data. Now, one thing I did kind of gloss over in all this discussion was some of the security settings, like here, or when we built the connection. There was also some information about security here. Going into all these different security settings and how things need to be set up on the external data source and on the AF server side is a very, very big topic that's really beyond the scope of this class. So I would refer you to the Pi System Explorer user guide, which has a lot of good reading on how to set up the security for creating imported or linked tables. If you're having trouble with the manual, there's also resources on our tech support site, or you can go ahead and give tech support a call, and we've had lots of experience setting up these types of tables in our tech support department, so they should be able to help out with getting things set up if you run into any problems. So that's it for the table lookup data reference and how to build the tables in your library with NAF. We'll move on and look at some more data references.